Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Good afternoon to everyone. And a very big thanks to IPSA and Sheikh Hassan Talib and AMEC and Naim Jina for inviting me to participate into this program. I can't believe it's the 7th symposium. It means I've been in South Africa for quite a while already. And it's not the first time I'm either participating or participating as public or as a speaker in one of these symposiums. And I can say that this is one of those moments where I feel that I'm a member of the South African Muslim community. So I'm happy to be here with you again. And I must also say that I was a little bit concerned when during the presentation of my friend Imam Rashid Umar, whom I also thank for discussing the topic of my presentation many times before I came here, because during his presentation he kept staring at me while he was saying that the research show an empiric correlation between recent converts to Islam from Western countries in their 20s and recruiting into ISIS. And he was staring at me, I was sitting there, and I happened to be one of those who became a Muslim in their 20s, and it was a few months after 9/11. So when I saw that after his presentation, the Minister of South African Police came in, I said, no, now they got me, he's coming for me. So yes, I've discussed a couple of times with Imam Rashid Omar the topic of my presentation today, and as the former director of ARIA, the Annual Review of Islam in Africa, we had an issue in the current issue. We had a special section on ISIS in South Africa, where amongst other things, we republished a document that I think is particularly interesting to look at one aspect of ISIS recruiting in South Africa. So we discussed that it could be good for my presentation to focus on that particular document, which is part of what you have in your package. You have the issue of ARIA, Annual Review of Islam in Africa in question, where we have this letter that was an open letter which was addressed to the South African Muslim public on the 21st of May of 2015. So tomorrow it will be 2 years now that this letter was sent by an important member of the Ulama community of South Africa, Mufti Rashid Musaji, who was addressing a call to join the Syria-based ISIS, Dawla al-Islamiyah, and was calling all South Africans to join him after he had joined the group with his family. And this letter, of course, generated what I think is a very healthy debate that perhaps it's been a little bit suppressed after that, because it touches on very sensitive nerves, I think, for the Muslim community today. But I think that it is important to readdress them. That is why we have, as the Annual Review of Islam in Africa, we had decided to publish that letter with some commentaries and with multiple responses from various members of the South African Muslim communities, many of whom are here with us, sharing either as presenters or as public. So why was this letter significant is because it challenged the popular view that sees the propaganda of extremist movements such as ISIS only appealing to a disenfranchised young public which is devoid of a solid background in Islam, which is certainly the case in many cases. It's certainly often the case, but it's not always the case. It also challenged the Ulama as the whole of the ISIS phenomenon. It challenges, I believe, the Ulama much more than a movement like Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, if we read the manifesto, the founding manifesto of Al-Qaeda, there is some reference to some Quranic verses, some reference to some hadith, but the language is the language basically of global strategies, world politics, language that many of the Ulama find, rightly or wrongly, is not part of their daily lexicon. Whereas ISIS has taken up the language of the Ulama. I'm not saying that, of course, the ISIS is the direct product of the culture of Ulama, far from being so. The relations is much more complex, but it has taken up that language and is using that language. And that's why it poses a much more direct threat and challenge also to the Ulama themselves. This means the fact that ISIS is using that language is a much more theological phenomenon if compared to its predecessor Al-Qaeda, means also that the classical answers that were given to this phenomenon by many of the ulama in the Al-Qaeda era are not effective anymore. One of the typical answers is you don't have qualifications. You are not qualified, and a jihad can only be declared by a khalifa. Now we have the khilafat, so what are we going to say? Now we have the khilafat, and we have texts about the khilafah. We have it. So that is a big challenge to the ulama as such. So in order to read this letter, this document that we have republished and that you can read it yourself, I suggest that there is two main things to look at. There is a psychological, religious psychological process. There is a narration, a narrative by a member of the South African ulama community of a process that we can say a process of conversion, intending this phenomenon as the psychology of religion does, not as a change from one religion to another, but as a deep psychological process, whereas classical psychologist of religion William James said, conversion is a process whereby some religious ideas that were previously peripheral in one's consciousness suddenly acquire centrality and becomes the main motivator towards action. I think that this letter narrates that process of conversion, if we want, to certain forms of Islam, to what we can define as the Jihadi Salafi project in one of its particular forms, which is the apocalyptic one, which is represented by ISIS. So there is a various umbrella, a Salafi broad theological umbrella, then there is the Salafi Jihadi methodology, and within the Salafi Jihadi there is ISIS, which represents a particular apocalyptic version of it. And this process is narrated in very lively words. Some sections are very superficial and I think very, also particularly distasteful in terms of the language that is used by Rashid Musaji in his letter, but other sections are quite lively. They narrate of a profound transformation that happened inside. So I will look at it from the point of view of the conversion, and I now will focus on the theology, because it directly challenges theologies. It directly challenges the movement that represent Islam in South Africa, and it calls them by name. The letter calls them by name, so I will also use name calling, not because I'm name calling, because I think that it is time to face, to be ready. In fact, I want to add that just a couple of weeks ago, one of my students came to me concerned because he had looked at some threads in some conversations between some of his friends, and there were people among the group of friends who were saying, Musaji is coming back to South Africa, and they were preparing to welcome him. So if it's true, and I don't know, of course, if this is true or not, that Rashid Musaji is coming back to South Africa, we must be ready as South African and as ulama to tackle the issue of what he wanted to say in his letter, whether he has retracted or not, and how can we engage him in, or the ulama can engage him in a meaningful theological engagement. So this conversion, I define this conversion, or rather, let's say, Musaji defines this conversion as conversion, if we want, he doesn't use, of course, the term conversion, but a change from what we can define as a Deobandi interpretation of Islam and understanding of Islam in which he was nurtured to a new, what he describes as understanding the true nature of Islam. So what are the main topics, the main issues that he tackles on? First of all, from the theological point of view, he seems to really refer to the terms of classical Salafi heresiography. There's always the reference to the term irja, murji'a, targeting the other Muslims as murji'ites, which we'll go back in a minute, which really comes, the murji'a is one of the terms from early heresiography in Islam, but it's not really a term that is really used today. Aside from the Salafi movements, we use it as a way of targeting non-Salafis, and within the Salafi group, there are those Salafis who adopt a more quietist position with reference to politics, which are also labeled as murji'ites by their jihadi opponents. So it's a term that really connotates a reading of Salafi jihadi sources by Musaji for quite some time, and let's say conviction in the truth of that perspective. Then there is also this methodology of jihad, and there is a lot of emphasis on the switching from a methodology that I use these terms, he doesn't describe it like that, of his traditional Deobandi training as, if we want, a sort of isolationist accommodation. That's how I describe it, to translate his words, where he sees the traditional ulama of the Deobandi school in which he is formed as being isolated from the environment, but in a very accommodative way, which does not challenge the kufr system, to use his own word, in which they are hosted. And thirdly, the apocalyptic action, the fact that there is a realization at a certain point, especially with the beginning of the Syria war and the declaration of the Khilafat, that we are in an apocalyptic moment and that we need to move from a traditional theology of awaiting a postponement. These are my terms, but it's clear that this represents what he is criticizing the traditional ulama for nurturing, a theology of awaiting the final era and postponing, to an activism that really sees this time as apocalyptic and takes action. So I quickly summarize. If these are the major points, I summarize how they are addressed in the letter very quickly, because I see that I have 7 minutes, and I also would like to have a final conclusion after the summary. So now the summary of the letter. The letter starts with a narration of his growth in South Africa, in a context where religion is dominated by what he calls the Hazrat system. The Hazrat system would be that means an exaggerated overemphasis on the role of and devotion to the traditional ulama, and also of the founding saints of scholars whose schools of thought and present, and it represents for him too much emphasis on the derivative rulings of certain schools of fiqh instead of the direct embodiment of certain of the practices enjoined by the hadith. So he criticized in particular the influence of Sufism in this system, and he says that already when he goes to study in India, when he studies in these institutions that represent that classical Hanafi Deobandi interpretation of Islam, is that he's already criticizing a certain aspect, for instance, the lack of Amr bil Maruf and Nahy anil Munkar, which means to enforce the rulings that are studied within the madrasa, to enforce them in the public. There is no such emphasis. That there is no emphasis on Sufi devotion. There is too much emphasis on Sufi devotions instead of Sunni obligatory ones. And two key issues, that issues like jihad and slavery are glossed over, even if the texts that are studied clearly address these issues, but then in their interpretation they are glossed over or postponed. So the ulama say, oh no, jihad is fine, we study it, but we must wait until the end of time. Or slavery, it was okay, but we studied all the practices related to slavery, but we don't practice it because it is disliked in Islam, and therefore it is abolished. So he says, I like to quote one or two quotes. We were saturated with the Buzruk system, and a synonym, I think, for the Hazrat system. And yes, we loved it and adored it. But all along, that nagging of guilt for not practicing the things that we studied did not leave our inner hearts. We were studying things, we were taught things, and we were not practicing them. And there was where we had a sense of guilt. There was this issue of jihad. Why do such piously learned people ignore jihad? But within the heart, the system was never really acceptable. This is typical of processes of conversion. So when you look back at a moment when you believe that you had already been expecting that transformation in your heart, you already knew in the depth of your heart that you would have you needed to liberate yourself from that version of Islam. A system riddled with fantasies, love stories, foreign type zikrs and shaggles, Hazrat worship, and shirk type beliefs could definitely not be the truth. So when he comes back to South Africa, he starts participating into this system, and he identifies the main problem of this system in what he defines as irja. And I've just already defined this term. He says that irja, which basically for him is apologizing on behalf of Allah, would be to, for him, irja, it's not a correct explanation in terms of the origins of the theological disputes in early Islamic history, but for him, in his reinterpretation of the concept of irja, it means that the ulama feel a little bit ashamed about certain aspects of Islamic tradition, and therefore they gloss over and they say, okay, but that's not really what Allah meant in these verses. And he says, most of the world ulama and sects today promote irja fully. That's why we need to be very careful if Musaj is coming back, or if there are other people who hold these views. We promote irja fully. It is a disease which only the true ulama will be able to combat with the aid of jihad against these sects. So it's preparing for jihad against us, against the Muslims, against the rest of the Muslims. There is a clear apostatization of other Muslims, which is the most characteristic trait of the theology of ISIS, which perhaps Al-Qaeda was not so, Al-Qaeda attempted to have a rather more inclusive theology. People today openly promote irja. Maybe that's what we are doing in this platform today in terms of his vision of irja. Not, of course, we are not promoting irja theologically, and they travel far and wide to propagate their void irja. And most importantly, he then names a number of Murji'a sects of today. He says the current Khilaf, so he has also a sort of his own ISIS Dawla heresiography. A sort of, and there are books written about it. So he's drawing from somewhere. He's drawing from growing ISIS-like type of heresiography, which in its turn draws on pre-existing Salafi literature on the topic. He says the current Khilafah is established upon the system of prophethood and in the time of our Prophet, and it is time now to scrutinize the sects that has penetrated the entire Muslim world. So who are the sects for him? The sects are the Sufi sect, which is the most deviant of all, Sheikh Ihsan Hendricks. The Mauludi sect, which is simply a bunch of singing and dancing offshoots of the Sufis. Maybe it's the Sambarelvi here. There would be the target here of our friend Fakhruddin Uwaisi. The Tabligh Jamaat, a deviant sect promoting passive Islam, the Mohandas Gandhi Islam. And then he has a sort of ambiguous relationship with his own school of where he provends for, the Deobandi ones. And that's why I think that I would like our Deobandi ulama to be particularly careful in tackling his coming back. And this is an invitation also to our co-panelist, Maulana Rawat, because he says that basically he acknowledges that the Deobandi school has the seed for the true version of Islam, but it has abandoned it. So, and it has harnessed all the previous three groups in their banner, so unfortunately today as it stands, they are also deviant for the truth. You'll read through the lines of what he says about the Deobandi group that he's preparing, if he had a chance, he would like to address to that particular public his call. This is quite evident from the ways in which he looks at, because for him he sees his transformation as, he says it was not easy to reject the current Deobandi system, founded by luminaries who were perhaps not part of the Irja camp. So he describes his process as a gradual understanding that you need to move out of that system. And here it seems that in his letter his plan, if he had the possibility to come back, would be to start that call again. So I think that one would need to be particularly careful about that. So he quotes about these Buzrug Sunnah love stories. It's a particularly challenging section, this, because he says, why were they all reading these stories about a sheikh who loved the Sunnah so much that he refrained from eating watermelon, I think, or something else, because he didn't know how to cut it, how the Prophet ﷺ cut it. Why are we reading all these stories and then we are refraining from practicing other things of the Sunnah like jihad and slavery? It's a challenging argument. It seems like an easy answer, but it's not. It is a very challenging one. How we read all these stories that celebrate all the minimal details of the Sunnah and of the sheikhs who perform them, and then why do we resist so much to practice what our Prophet did in terms of course, jihad and slavery, which are the two central subjects. So to conclude, then, first of all, there is this reawakening, which is very important when he narrates his reawakening, and I will cut it short because you can read the letter for yourself, and where the hadith of Sham, the hadith portraying a final battle taking place in Syria, play a particular role. So these things that he had seen in the hadith, that now he says, I can be a protagonist of this battle. And also the fact that ISIS is so much despised by the rest of the Muslims, for him is an encouragement. The fact that this dawla is despised by the rest of the Muslims is an encouragement, because this would be a saved group, a minimal group of people who would be saved. And also the fact that the life with the dawla is portrayed as hell, for him is the job of the Dajjal at the end of time, as many hadiths portray that the Dajjal would invite you to a heaven, which is in fact a hell, which would be our kufr system, which is, according to his words, our life here in South Africa. And whereas he would be warning you of a hell, which in fact is a heaven, and that is of course the hell of the Dawla Islamiyah in Raqqa, which is in fact a heaven. So that's if we want, in the phases of his conversion, this would represent the reawakening, where all these little pieces in his religious consciousness that were standing there, why not jihad, why not slavery, why not this, then come together into this final revelation in its etymological term. This final apocalypse means revelation, sorry, apocalypse, the original meaning of apocalypse is revelation, comes together, all these pieces into the dream of participating into the Dawla al-Islamiyya and contributing to the Dawla al-Islamiyya. So to conclude, yes, I think that on the line of what was already, I think, stressed by the presentations of Rashid Humar and Naim Jina, but perhaps giving some pieces of reflection that directly address the state issue, I would like to make a call for discussing the theology of ISIS, because ISIS, if compared to movements like Al-Qaeda, presents itself much more as a theological understanding of Islam, and also invite the community of ulama of the various sects that are named, not one, the various groups, not call it, I don't like the term sects, he calls them sects, the various groups that are named, to prepare a document or to prepare an invitation if ever the author of this letter is coming back to South Africa. I mean, he's joining his letter, say things that are very serious, and I think that the ulama should try to address these issues rather than gloss over them again, as rightly or wrongly Rashid Musaji has been accusing the ulama of being doing for too long. So addressing these issues directly, jihad, what do we understand for jihad, what do we understand as slavery, and how do we understand this particular time, because the apocalyptic interpretation is also very, very important, and perhaps demanding the author of this letter to publicly retract from the content of this letter, in particularly for what concerned such a radical excommunication of virtually all the members of the South African Muslim communities and all the members who are sitting in this room today. Thank you very much.